Thank you for coming. This is an interesting time of day for a talk, and I wasn't sure what the attendance would be, and I'm really heartened to see so many of you here. I hope that you'll enjoy, find interesting what I have to say. I actually brought a little video clip that, Jonathan, do you know how to make that happen?
Yep.
We're conducting an experiment in the city called Testing. It consists of a walk. We take people to a variety of sites in the area immediately surrounding the lab, and we ask them to carry smartphones and to wear special bracelets that measure their stress levels. And the idea is to look at different kinds of contrasts in the city, differences in how places make people feel, how they affect their stress levels, and how they affect their ability to think properly.
We went to some churches, some hospitals, then some busy, noisy places, and where we collected some data over there, and we had some good interaction about the places and about the privacy, about the maintenance of the places where we went today. Why we are doing this stuff? Because this study will help us to create a design that how people can use those designs to make that.
Oh.
Uh-oh.
Uh-oh. Uh-oh.
I'll tell you the rest.
Yeah, I don't know what happened there.
All right.
All right. Looks like
that video clip was something that was actually put together by the BMW Guggenheim Lab, which is a venture that I've been involved with now for the past couple of years. And most of what I'm going to talk to you about today connects with that global adventure that happily they invited me to come along with them to experience. I'm an academic, so I tend to give kind of more formal presentations, but I would like to encourage you to prevent me from doing that as much as possible by interrupting me and asking me questions whenever you want to. So I have a series of slides here and a series of ideas that I want to convey to you, but at any point I'm happy to ditch this presentation and just talk to you. So as questions arise, please feel free to interrupt and let's have a conversation. I'm an experimental psychologist, and I'm more than I am anything else. I guess I'd call myself an environmental psychologist. And the premise of environmental psychology is really pretty straightforward, and I've written it on this slide. Basically, the idea is that the design of places affects how we think and how we feel, and that we can use the methods of psychology, experimental psychology, to try to deconstruct that connection between design, between how places work, how they're built, and how human behavior works. The jewel in the crown for environmental psychology has always been this really simple idea that natural spaces make us feel better, make us feel restored. And it's, I would say, a conservative estimate to say that about half of the publications in my field relate to this one key idea, the idea that we need to have exposure to nature in order for us to be healthy and to be well adjusted. And this all started with some relatively small scale studies about 25 years ago that showed things like, for example, that people who were staying in hospitals who had views of nature from their windows recovered more quickly and required less pain relief than people who had views of things like brick walls. And following on from that one finding, there's been a veritable avalanche of research showing that in all kinds of ways, exposure to nature influences our emotions, it influences our physiology, it influences how we think and how we pay attention to different parts of our environment. So that's been great, but there are all kinds of other interesting questions in environmental psychology that I think we're just beginning to tackle, and I'll tell you about a few of them today. One of the mainstays of methodological mainstays of environmental psychology has been something called the picture proxy method. And the picture proxy method is a method that's used for trying to get at what people like, our preferences in terms of environment. And the very basic idea is this, that you show people pairs of things, pairs of images, and you simply ask them to indicate which of these two things they like better. And this method has been, again, it's a method that goes back to the roots of environmental psychology. It's been used time and time again to try to get at ideas about place preference, and again, ideas about how places influence our feelings and our thoughts. And those methods have shown us some interesting things about our preferences for different kinds of places. So, for example, one idea that's been around now for quite a while is the idea that we prefer nice combinations of what's referred to as prospect and refuge. And the idea is, it's more or less intuitive. The idea is that if you ask people what kinds of views they prefer, or even look at where they go in different kinds of environments, then what you discover is they like to be in places where they have some kind of feeling of protection, some kind of feeling of refuge, but at the same time they have prospect. In other words, they can see what's out there. They can see, for example, maybe what's coming, or they can see what's available to them in the landscape. And as you can imagine, it's not very hard to parlay ideas about our preferences for prospect and refuge into evolutionary theories about why it might have behooved our ancient forebears to have preferred locations where they had these nice combinations of protection, but also knowing what was out there. And you can use a basic idea like prospect and refuge to account for everything from the perpetual popularity of wing-back chairs to the design of golf courses. And it has been used in all kinds of different contexts to try to get at preference. Another kind of general principle that a lot of people in environmental psychology talk about is what's referred to as mystery. And the idea here is that people like to see scenes where not everything is revealed, where you can see something that may be attractive, but there's the promise of more. And again, you can use our attraction to mystery to explain everything from why it is that sometimes when we go for a hike, we end up going much farther than would be prudent. We can't stop going forward because we need to see what's just around that next bend. To preferences for different kinds of images. Landscape paintings, for example. Landscape paintings that have this element of mystery have also been shown to have an intrinsic attraction for people. Now, these studies, these picture proxy methods, have told us all kinds of interesting things about our preferences. But what I'm really interested in is how those kinds of findings relate to the kinds of things that happen in the real world. And I want to just give you a little illustration based on some of my own experience that you might think of as the idea of traveling with beginner mind. This is kind of my analog of the picture proxy method, how it might work in real life. I'm going to show you, first of all, a picture of my hometown. This is Waterloo. We were just talking before I came up here about what it's like to live in Waterloo. And I want to point out, this is not CGI. This is a real place. This is what it looks like. It looks kind of not busy, would be one way of putting it. When I show this slide to people in other countries, one of the things that I like to point out, and everybody here will understand this already, is that if you look at these streets, which are are pretty much empty. There's a nice looking convertible here. Hardly any cars on the street. You can see a few dots of people. I'm not sure if everybody can make this out. But what I find fascinating about this is that there are 3 people standing at this empty intersection where there are no people and no cars, and they're waiting for the light to change. I don't know very many other cities where you'd find people kind of standing there waiting for the light to change from red to green. So this is where I spend a lot of my time. This is the main intersection in Waterloo, Ontario, and this could be a Saturday morning. And so the question is, the caption is kind of slid down to the bottom of the slide, but the question is basically, what happens to me when I go somewhere like this? This is a picture that I took on my first day on a visit to Mumbai last December, which I also did in connection with the BMW Guggenheim Lab. And my experience in this context, India was a place that I'd never been to before. I deliberately shielded myself from, as much as possible, knowledge about the city, because I wanted to experience the city, a real place, almost as if I was in one of those picture proxy experiments to see what happened to me. And the experience was completely disorienting and bewildering. I didn't know where I was lost, I was a little bit frightened. I didn't know what anything was. Relatively few things in my immediate environment were recognizable, and carrying out even very simple tasks like finding something to eat, finding my way to work, my way back to the hotel, became monumental for me. It became really very difficult. So one of the things I like to think about this is that asking me to do this kind of transition from my fairly empty hometown to a place like Mumbai is a little bit like what it's like to take someone in the laboratory and to do the picture proxy method with them. It's telling you something, but it's not necessarily telling you what it's like to actually live in one of these places, and that's what I really want to try to get at. Okay, so how do we make the experience of place real in order to study it? Well, I've tried a bunch of things. One of the things that I do in Waterloo is I run a lab, a virtual reality lab. And what we're able to do in this laboratory is to build basically any kind of environment that you can place into a computer's memory. And then we can put people into a headset so that in many ways they feel as though they're actually in this place. And if you look at this picture, it shows a few of the environments that we've used. We can make nice architectural interiors. We can make wild places, those natural environments that other environmental psychologists have shown so effectively are important. We can make cityscapes, and we can have people navigate their way through those spaces, and we can very carefully measure what's going on in their minds and what's going on in their bodies. So the small image that you can see on this slide basically shows you part of the setup from an experiment where we set up full-scale interiors of houses. And we had people come to the lab. We told them to imagine that they were coming to real estate open houses. They were considering buying a house. We threw them into, well, we didn't tell the ethics board we were throwing anybody anywhere. We gently placed people into different kinds of houses, and we asked them to wander around, and we measured their bodies, and we asked them lots of questions. And in many of our experiments, we've shown that VR is actually a little bit better than the picture proxy method. We can get some of the same kinds of effects that others have shown with picture proxy. We can get some effects that others have shown in actual real environments. For example, the restorative effect of nature. Virtual nature works really well, but it's still not real. Now, and then, as I said, a couple of years ago, along came this fantastic opportunity to work with the BMW Guggenheim Lab. This is kind of a traveling think tank that ultimately will go through 12 different cities, and the objective is to land in a city and to make a hub to which people who live in the city will come. consider their city, consider more generally problems of urban issues and urban design. And I was lucky enough to be asked to go along with them for the first 3 cities. We visited New York, Berlin, and Mumbai. And they asked me to design an experiment that somehow tackled this question of the influence of different kinds of urban spaces on people's minds and on their bodies. So what I did was to, and you saw a little bit of this in the video snippet at the beginning of my talk. What I did was to design a series of what I called psychogeographic walks. And basically the idea was to select a series of locations in each of the cities that showed some site-specific contrasts, and I'll get in a second to exactly what I mean by that, to take people to those sites and to measure their bodies and their minds, just as we would in the laboratory, but in this case trying to do the same kind of thing on the street, in a real place, with real people who in many cases actually live in these cities. So here's an example of how one of these experiments was conducted. This is a photograph taken on our Berlin walk. And this is the kind of image that really strikes terror into the hearts of my more laboratory-based colleagues. When they look at this, there's all kinds of things going on. And one of the things that's not really going on very well in the same way that it would in a laboratory is experimental control. When you take an experiment out on the streets, anything can and usually does happen. So what you're seeing here is a couple of individuals, the fellow in the green jacket and the lady in the orange scarf, are looking down at blackberries, and those blackberries are programmed to ask them questions about what they're seeing. And you can see a fellow who's grandly gesturing into the sky, and he is actually the facilitator on this walk, and he's directing people so that they know where they should be focusing their attention, and he's making sure that people don't get lost and that they know how to work the equipment. And so part of our methodology was to ask people questions about their feelings and their thoughts using these programmed blackberries. Another part of it was to record something called skin conductance. This is an old method in psychology. It's basically the guts of the lie detector principle. And the idea is that this is a physiological value that varies with the state of our sweat glands, and it can be used as a measure of physiological arousal or excitement. So we used bracelets that were very unobtrusive. People wore them on their wrists, and they continuously measured people's state of arousal during our psychogeographic walks in each of the cities. And to give you just a little illustration of how these bracelets work, this is a little piece of data from fairly on in these studies. This was the photograph that you're looking at here is an overhead view of part of our walk in New York City. It was in New York City's Lower East Side, around Houston Street, which is a very busy, wide street. And one of the things that we did was to have people wear these bracelets while walking across Houston Street. And at the intersection, at the crossing where we asked them to walk, which is where you see the blue dots, there's all kinds of traffic. There are taxis turning, there are buses. It takes a fair bit of concentration to get yourself safely across the street, even if the light is green. And if you look in the bottom of this image, you can see some graphs. The graphs show curves. What those curves represent is people's state of skin conductance. And what you're seeing here is that in general it goes up when people are crossing Houston Street, which indicates that they're physiologically aroused as they're carrying out this piece of behavior. And in this case, that's not really a bad thing at all, because you don't want to be kind of dopey and not really paying attention when you're crossing a busy street. So seeing that people's bodies react in this way to this context is nice. It shows that they're adapting to their environment. But that's an illustration of how the cuffs can be used. Now I'll give you a couple of slides that show you the kinds of contrasts that we looked at. We looked at what we referred to and others have referred to as impermeable facades. And on the left side of this slide, this is actually, it looks a bit strange like a mirror or something, but it's actually two very different places. The right side of the slide is our impermeable facade in Berlin, and the left side is our impermeable facade in New York City. And by impermeability, what I mean is basically that there's really nowhere to go in this place other than straight down that street. There are no opportunities to go into or out of stores, for example. There's not much to look at. There are no windows to look into. It's hard to get into or out of this place except via the two ends. And
which one is Berlin, sorry?
Berlin is on the right. And contrast that with permeable facades, which is really the opposite. Permeable facades are facades where there are lots of opportunities to go into or out of the place. There's lots of things going on. It's easy to get in and out. And as our results show, just to kind of foreshadow what's coming in a second, people like this. Not all that surprising. We also looked at, because of course we had to, because this has been done so well in other experiments, if nothing else, just to make sure that we were on the same wavelength as laboratory-based investigations, we had to look at natural spaces. And with the exception of Mumbai, and I'll talk more about this in a little bit, it was pretty easy to find really nice natural spaces in both New York and in Berlin. This is our natural space in Berlin. It was a gorgeous old cemetery. Our natural space in New York City was a community garden. I think I have some images of that coming up fairly soon. We also looked at what, for want of a better term, I referred to as ambiguous places. This is our ambiguous place in New York City. It's kind of an unused median strip on Allen Street. It's one of the reasons for focusing on this site was that it was actually under active discussion for redevelopment. People were trying to figure out what to do with this space. So we thought there might be some merit in looking at what was happening to people now when they went there. And we had some really interesting results that I'll tell you about in a few slides. Right. Now in terms of what we found, we discovered to our great relief that just as other people had shown with very different kinds of experiments, people really like nature. Whether you ask them by means of our BlackBerry tasks, or debrief them after the experiment to ask them what they thought of the whole walk, or measure with the bracelets what's happening in their bodies, by every measure that we used, happy, relaxed things were happening when people were in natural spaces. And on the left here, now you can see our natural space in New York City. It was a gorgeous community garden. And on the right again is a different view of the cemetery that we used in Berlin.
Did you ask them the same questions in all of the places, or were the questions tailored to the place? Like the questions that they got on their BlackBerries?
Great question. We asked them the same questions at each of the sites. The way that the BlackBerries were programmed, I didn't bring this level of detail on my slides, but basically people were shown mannequins, faces, cartoon faces that had different expressions ranging from an all-encompassing smile to a nasty frown, and similar kinds of mannequins for states of arousal. And we asked people to indicate which of those mannequins reflected their current state. And then we asked them to give us words. So we asked them some more kind of pointed questions about the places, things like, what do you see happening here? If you could do anything with this place, what would you do with it? And we took all of those words and we did some frequency analysis on the words to get more kind of a qualitative sense of how people felt about the places.
Sorry. I also have a question. When you say people like something, does that mean like a low, whatever, stress response? Or
Yeah.
I mean, frankly, you when I met you in Berlin and you did this more specific presentation, you recommended this one app, this happiness app, and I did that for a while. Now, to my great shock, I turned out to be happiest when I was at work, and kind of in kind of engaged situations.
Yeah.
Is it also a question of personality, or is it really just true? Would you say you put me into a park and I'm happier in Hyde Park than I'm sitting here?
Yeah. You know what? We ask ourselves that kind of question all the time, also in the context of our lab studies. Because, one of the things that people say is, what about those of us who live in cities all of our lives and we're actually a little bit afraid of going into the forest? It doesn't seem to make sense that everybody would like these natural spaces. There is variability, there's no question about that. But in general, and especially the physiological measurements, in general, everything points towards people generally feeling better in natural spaces, and reporting, not always, but often reporting lower levels of arousal or excitement. And certainly with the bracelets, we're measuring the lowest levels of arousal in almost every case.
Which you interpret as a good thing.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
I'm just saying, I mean,
Well,
we're different creatures now than we used to be, right?
Yeah.
I mean, as you said, we're urban dwellers, and
Yeah.
we also thrive on, or we seem to fool ourselves maybe,
Yeah,
to thrive on pace and urban engagement.
yeah. I see what you're getting at. I mean, the idea that it might not necessarily always be a good thing to be at a low level of arousal, and it's certainly not. I'll talk a bit more about this later on, but the ideal is that we want to be able to modulate our arousal levels in our day-to-day lives. So you don't want to spend all of your time in kind of like a semi-comatose state.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you don't want to be jazzed up all the time like you're standing in the middle of Houston Avenue. So it's a matter of finding those kinds of balances. So I'm certainly not saying that overall it would be best if we could all just live in parks all the time and never venture into cities. But what I am saying is that there's little question with these results or the results of tons of laboratory studies that we do have this almost magical restorative response to exposure to nature. And that does seem to transcend individual experiences to a large degree. Even when people say they don't like nature. And my next slide actually, well, this slide actually is speaks to that just a little bit. I saw another hand.
Could you just describe briefly who your subjects were?
Sure.
Were they city dwellers, for example?
We, some of them were, some of them weren't. We basically recruited by advertising both online and physically at the lab site. So one of the criticisms of this study would be that we're to some extent our sample selection is biased, because we're attracting, by virtue of what that lab does, it attracts people who are interested in urban issues. So our sample was slanted towards people like architecture students, people with backgrounds in design, planners, people with an active interest in urban affairs. But one of the things that we did look at, and I don't think I brought very much on this contrast, but one of the things that we looked at was the distinction between the responses of people who were residents of a city and people who were visitors. So not necessarily whether they were from the country or from the city. We didn't ask that, but we asked about some other kinds of demographic variables.
Was there any kind of priming done for the experiments? Was there a need to prime your subjects? And if so, what kind of priming?
Priming in the sense of
You
giving
prepare
them instructions?
Yeah, you prepare them, let's say, with a scenario, or what have you?
Yeah, the way that we did that was basically to have a conversation with them at the lab site before we started the walk. So we tried to get some baseline values at the lab site, especially for things like the verbal response questions. People tended to need to have some elaboration of exactly what we meant by some of the questions that we were asking them. But we also did the baseline measures for the mannequins at the lab site as well. Any other questions before I forward you ahead? Okay. Oh, so this I thought was interesting. This is an interesting caveat with respect to people's affinities to natural environments. This is something that happened quite frequently in New York, and I think once in Berlin, and a couple of times in Mumbai. people weren't actually able to enter our natural spaces. For one reason or another, gates were closed and locked, fences were erected, rules were imposed, sometimes sort of out of the blue. And those kinds of changes that had a large effect on people's responses, people's self-assessment, people answering questions about how they felt. But they had much less of an effect on their physiology. So, in other words, to our eye, it looked as though standing at the gates of a beautiful community garden in New York would piss you off, in the sense of wishing that you could go inside. But in terms of the physiological restoration that it produced, the effects were pretty much as large as if they'd been standing right inside the garden. I thought that was quite interesting, and it kind of connects with some of the research that's done showing that even showing people pictures of nature can be an effective means of eliciting this restorative response. We discovered, and I mentioned this briefly, people like, and by like here I mean people responded positively on our scales of affect or emotion. People were happy generally in the locations of open facades, and they were less happy in closed facades. When we looked at, and we were able to do this really well in New York City, better than we were able to do it in Berlin or Mumbai because of the kind of sample we got. But when we compared the responses of local residents with visitors in New York City, which was possible there because we had tons of tourists who came to the lab site, we found some interesting differences in the sense that people who don't know a city tend to seem to respond much more to what their senses are revealing about the environment. People who are locally resident and who know what's going on are much more likely to respond to their memories or the stories of an area. So the image that you're seeing now here is, oh, just to go back to the previous image for a second. So this was that ambiguous median strip in New York City, and visitors to New York loved this site, which really took me by surprise because it's, you know, there was garbage and there were homeless people living on the street. And when I asked people, you know, why do you like it here? They, you know, a few people said things along the lines of, I feel like this is the real New York. So somehow their sensory environment was sending them signals that this location had some kind of authenticity that maybe wasn't linked to areas like those impermeable facades. In Berlin, the stopping point at which people were the happiest was this one, the one in the picture. This is actually a stopping point in front of a squatter house, which one could well imagine, without knowing very much about the history or culture of Berlin, you might look at this and think, this is a pretty seedy place. There's probably not very nice stuff going on in this area. Maybe it's a little bit dangerous. People who live in Berlin and understand the cultural history of these squats responded really positively to the kinds of things that they symbolize about the politics and the culture of Berlin. So they loved this site, which to me suggests that people who know the history of a site are going to respond much differently to people who don't. And that all of those rules that environmental psychologists like to talk about in terms of what attracts us to a place, because they're based on our senses rather than our stories, may be missing a really important part of what it takes to build a nice city. So a few things about stress responses. What you're looking at on this slide is an overhead view of our walk-in in New York, and you can see that there's this wavy blue contour. What I'm showing here is basically a GPS track of one of our walks in New York, and overlaid on that GPS track is a contour. The blue that you can see, the height of the blue correlates with levels of arousal. So I should mention that the method of showing these kinds of data like this is not something that I invented. It was first done by an artist named Christian Nold, who did walks in different places in Europe, again with the idea of looking at the relationship between place and arousal. One of the things that's quite striking that you can see here, and you saw a little bit of this in the street crossing on Houston Street, is that arousal levels really rise and fall as we move through a city. So what you're seeing here, if you look at this image, the direction of the walking is basically from left to right across the image. And the leftmost point is just a little bit out of the image. It shows people leaving that community garden. And the rightmost point is that ambiguous median strip on Allen Street. And you can see that there's this tremendous crescendo in arousal and excitement as people leave that quiet garden space and move into the busy and noisy and an exciting city.
Does arousal always correlate with being unhappy, or is there
No, there's definitely happy arousal. Maybe I should rephrase.
Yeah.
That's
what I meant. That was my question.
City into the city, do you feel that they're answering being happy, but at the same time being, aroused, or?
Yeah.
Find any?
So there are interesting questions about when you ask differences between self-assessment and what you're measuring with the bracelets. So yes, you're right that being aroused is not always a bad thing. We can think of lots of states where we're both happy and aroused. So the dimension of arousal is kind of orthogonal to the dimension of affect. You can be happy or unhappy. You can be aroused and not aroused, and different combinations of those two things mean different things. It's relatively easy for us to measure physiological arousal with a bracelet. Unfortunately, other than, or even if we had something like a brain imaging device that people could wear as they walked around, it's much more difficult to measure happiness or anything like it without just asking people how they feel. So in the case of self-assessment, we've got affect, and we've also got self-assessed arousal for whatever that's worth, and that's something else that I want to talk about. But for arousal, we've also got measurements of the body itself. I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Yeah, because you had the happy faces, like the frowny faces. I don't know if they were aroused, were they always sad faces, or were they happy and sad?
No,
Yeah.
People could definitely be happy and aroused. Typically in green spaces, they didn't report that, and the physiology didn't show it either. But in other places, they did. Like for example, those permeable facades, people were generally aroused. Typically, the bracelets showed that, but not always, and they were generally quite happy as well. So you can be happy and excited. All right. A little bit more about, I hope you can see at least some of what's going on in this image. These are pictures taken in Mumbai. I haven't said very much about the Mumbai experiment. It was really quite qualitatively different to both New York and Berlin. And when I did the study in New York, when I got to Berlin, I had never been to Berlin either, and I expected Berlin to be more similar to New York than it actually was. And I left that experience thinking these are two really quite different cities, and of course they are. But then when I went to Mumbai, reflecting on the comparison of New York and Berlin, it's like New York and Berlin are like this, and Mumbai is somewhere over here. It's a vastly different kind of city with a whole set of interesting issues and problems. And one of the big problems is traffic. And the images here show what's really not very atypical of a traffic situation in Mumbai. It's very difficult to get anywhere by vehicle. It's extremely difficult, especially for a newcomer and even for a seasoned hand, to cross streets. There are lights mostly honored in the breach. It's not much of a big deal for a car to drive through a red light. We see people here who sometimes go through stale yellows. Well, in Mumbai, people start to go when there's maybe 5 or 10 seconds of red light left before the light turns green. As a pedestrian, it's kind of somehow a cross between ballet and parkour, trying to get yourself from one side of a street to the other side of a street. In many cases, the cars just simply never stop. So the only way to navigate across a street as a pedestrian is basically to watch the cars and the trucks and the buses and to time yourself so that you're kind of running in front of the cars and hoping that they don't catch up with you before you get across the intersection. So this is one of the things, when I got to Mumbai, I was completely flummoxed by how to take a simple kilometer-long walk from one place to another while crossing these incredible intersections. When I talked to Mumbaikers, I said, you know, what about the traffic and as a pedestrian crossing these roads, and doesn't that exact a toll? And they would say, no, it's no big deal. We do it every day. And in fact, when we asked people in Mumbai, in one of our stops in Mumbai, we had people basically stand in the middle of a very busy intersection. So there were cars and all kinds of vehicles going in every direction. And they were quite safe where they were standing, but they were surrounded by this mess. And of course, we had to get them into the middle of this intersection, which meant navigating through all of the moving cars. And when we asked people to assess their state of arousal or excitement in those circumstances, I'm sure very few of you can actually read the words, but this is self-assessed arousal in the middle of the roadway. And it was actually the lowest mean value of all of our stopping points. We had some really lovely stopping points. But when we measured the state of their bodies, we discovered that people standing in the middle of this roadway were actually acutely aroused. Their bodies were more aroused in the roadway than they were in any other places. So this suggests that, and this gets back to your question, that you know, we can ask people to self-assess arousal, we can measure it directly. The two don't necessarily coincide, which really interests me a lot, because it suggests that in our day-to-day lives, certainly in these kinds of extreme conditions, but maybe in less extreme conditions like living in Toronto, we may be less in touch than we ought to be with how different places are affecting our levels of arousal and excitement. This is just a little bit more on that. This is another kind of mini experiment that I did in Mumbai in one of the busiest intersections, the Kalanagar Junction it's called in Mumbai. And it's horrendous. I've got a little video here. I hope this will play. But it may be a bit too small for you to make out much of what's going on here. But what it shows is, as you can maybe make out, cars coming from a bunch of different directions. There are some tiny dots. There's a person here walking across the street. If you watch back here, this is fantastic. There's, not for this person, there's the fellow who's running at full pelt across the road in front of all of these cars. The image on the right side of this slide, again, is those arousal contours. And this was an experiment that I conducted with a very small sample of people in Mumbai. And we took them through that intersection and had them cross multiple times in different directions. And we took them to bad spots and less bad spots. And generally found that the less rule-bound the intersection was, the more aroused these people were. In spite of everything that they were saying, their bodies were actually showing considerable states of stressful arousal when conducting these feats of navigation across these busy streets.
So that's not good, right?
Well, I mean, it's good in the sense of you want to have all systems firing when you're doing this, because it's hard. But if your whole life consists of a lot of this, then it's not good, because it puts you in kind of a state of chronic stress. And we know that chronic stress has all kinds of deleterious effects on us, ranging from mental disorders to chronic disease like heart disease. So it's all about designing a city that has the right kind of balance of both high arousal and low arousal, rather than presenting people with constantly situations that produce high
but
arousal.
when I've been in neighborhoods that there is nothing about in the streets, that is depressing too.
Yep.
So what will be worse, to have too much, or to have nothing? I prefer to have a lot than to have nothing, personally.
Yeah, they're very different kinds of problems. In terms of, that's an interesting question. Whether chronic exposure to a boring environment. I was going to say something nasty about Waterloo again, but is as stressful as chronic exposure to something like this. That's a really interesting question.
I prefer noise and people and cars and nothing.
I'm wondering about how you accommodated in measuring, because we know noise, lots of noise and loud noise do produce or induce cortisol, very high cortisol levels. So you're talking now skin conductivity. So how would you make sure that it's not because of all the noise that the conductivity is higher than it would be in a less noisy environment?
Yeah, that's a great question. How would we dissociate the pure effects of noise from everything else, that like the risk in the environment? That's the kind of question that's easier to answer in a laboratory setting than it is on the street, where you've got everything kind of full on. I mean, I could think of ways of doing it, which might be the kinds of experiments that you could do as follow-ups to what I've done. But in this case, we basically wanted to just look at the pure unadulterated experience of what it's like to cross a busy street, which you're right, consists of noise, extreme noise in the case of Mumbai. I did measure sound levels on the streets, and they were, in an area like this, around 110 to 120 decibels. So loud enough that there should be a booming business in audiology in Mumbai. A lot of hearing loss, I would expect. Not as high noise in the other places that we've studied. We did a few measurements in Berlin, and of the three cities, definitely Berlin would be the quietest city. But yeah, you're right, that's an important covariate.
And following up on that, did you also measure, let's say, recovery times from the peak stress level or conductivity levels to when they were back to the baseline you established in before you started?
It was hard in the context of the experiments that we did. It was hard to measure that really cleanly. Again, in more kind of experimentally based follow-ups to this, we could. What we did to try to manage those kinds of carryover effects was to vary the order in which people visited different locations on the walks. So overall, those kinds of order effects, the recovery time from one place to another would wash out. It would average out over different sets of walks. But in terms of actually measuring how long, I mean, an interesting question, for example, is you take yourself to a nice community garden or whatever, how long do you have to stay there? How long do the effects last after you leave? That kind of work, so far as I know, has not been done. It will be not impossible to do in these kinds of contexts, but it's not something that we did, at least in these initial studies.
And the third question before I point out to someone else, do you think, or did you try to experiment with it if someone was in memory retracing the same walk, but not physically, just memorizing the steps? Would you find the same stress indicators or not?
We haven't done that, but others have done those experiments, at least with looking at exposure to green spaces. So there are studies where people have been asked to recollect positive experiences in natural environments. And you do get a restorative effect. It's not as big as the effects that you get with exposure to the real thing, but the effects are definitely there. as far as asking people to relive a stressful experience like crossing a street, I'm not sure whether anybody has done that. I can't think of a study like that, but it would be interesting to look at the other side of the coin for sure.
Why did you do the study in these 3 cities?
The simple answer would be because that's where the BMW Guggenheim Lab was going. So all of this work was sponsored by them. As far as what wizardry goes into the selection of the cities for their Grand World Tour, there are all kinds of considerations ranging from the size of the city, what are the interesting issues in that city, and also who'll have us. Not everybody wants us. There's a bit of a story with Berlin. Berlin was a bit of a struggle. There were people who didn't want this lab in Berlin, and so that had some influence on the selection of the site, and also whether we were able to do the work in Berlin or not. So the cities weren't selected by me on the ground, on any sort of experimental grounds. They were basically following the route of BMW Guggenheim.
So two quick questions. One is, first, is there a difference between kind of the response between someone in a manufactured green space, like a garden, and like a wild green space? And second of all, did you look at the experience of people moving through urban or like constructed environments in natural environments in alternative transportation than just walking, like on a bike or on a skateboard or in a car or any of those kind of like, and how their response?
Great questions. First of all, in terms of the first question about the influence of the wildness of a natural environment, we've done a little bit of work in VR with that. We've built virtual spaces that either are simulations of very kind of manicured English garden styles, as opposed to very kind of wild places. And we found measurable differences, small but measurable differences. I know of one study which is very interesting where they looked at I can't think of the correct word to describe this, but basically the range of different types of plants that are in an environment. And they showed that the greater the range, the more different types of plants in a place, the more effective it was in producing restoration. In terms of your question about how people get to a site, like we didn't do that. I can't think of anybody else who's done exactly what you described, which doesn't mean that it hasn't happened, because it's an enormous literature. But one of the questions that people have been very careful to look at is looking at the dissociation between the effects of exercise. Exercise also makes us feel good. So normally when people look at the influence of a walk in the woods to produce restoration, they compare it with a walk that's of the same level of exertion but through an urban environment. And they show that the restorative effects only happen in the natural environment. But as far as I know, nobody has taken people into green spaces on a gurney. It would be kind of a cool experiment to do that.
Something to do with that comment. I spent quite a bit of time in Scarborough, and if you're familiar with Scarborough, it's a lot of green space areas neglected. People avoid going there. You imagine just by curiosity, people will try to go there in groups with your families. You avoid it. Nobody wants to go just because they're neglected. There are lots of green nature, but they don't use it. Not attractive.
So by neglected, what do you mean?
It's not aesthetics. Like, you know, like we have beautiful.
So not groomed, but wild.
Yeah, but it would be attractive to some people, wouldn't it?
Well, as I said, I grew up in Scarborough, and I spent most of my troubled adolescence somewhere within spitting distance of the Scarborough Bluffs, for better or for worse.
Of course.
And back then, that was also, I think, what you would describe as neglected. I mean, there was no grooming. It was very wild, and at times it was actually dangerous. But I think it had a tremendous effect on my life. I visited there a few weeks ago with an old friend of mine who grew up in the same area, and he said, you know, have you ever thought that we would be very different people if we had not had access to something like this when we were kids and teenagers? It was our, you know, it was our shopping mall. It was where we met our friends. It was where we hung out on the weekends.
But the mountain, the rocks, of course, is attractive, even if it's in nature.
Yeah, well, but yeah, I mean, but how do you decide, you know, what's attractive and what isn't? And it's not the human hand in maintaining a green space that needs to determine whether it's attractive or not. In fact, the experiments that I was just describing to you suggest otherwise, that green spaces that have less of a human hand are maybe the ones that produce this more powerful sense of restoration in people. So, you know, there are all kinds of factors here, though. You know, when you were describing a neglected green space, in the back of my mind, one of the alarms that was going off was, you know, danger. You know, people who live in cities have to think about risk.
You can't walk like you would walk in a park because it's clean. You can't even walk there. You would have to, you know.
Because of garbage?
No, just because it's too much grass, too tall, the grass, and it's not
you know, but maybe there's also a difference between use, and you're partly, I think, speaking of use. And what I find really surprising here and kind of very hopeful is that basically you're telling us that effect is not even so much tied to use. Like, look at the people in Berlin who walked across the cemetery. You know, that is not going for a family picnic on the Toronto Islands. Like, you don't maybe even, this is sort of what I'm hearing, I think, that you don't even have to make this conscious decision. I am now going for a relaxing walk with my family across the West Toronto rail paths, and I will be restored. You're telling me that the effect, I think, will happen whether I, well, want to or not, or I might just look out of my window onto the parquet at the end of my street in downtown Toronto. That's also not fantastic, and it has a lot of garbage, but right, there's use and physiological effect.
I think that is the message. I think that, so in Berlin, for example, we, that cemetery was gorgeous as a green space to my eye, and to, I would say, you know, anybody who bothered to really talk to me about their experiences being there reflected the same thing, but they felt really good there. And that, you know, when we selected it, we kind of worried, like, you know, it may be a gorgeous space, but it's a cemetery. So are people going to have enhanced feelings of mortality when they're there that will work against this restoration? And we got some hints of that in some of the things that people said in their verbal responses, but it didn't show up in the physiology. So it was like the gardens that people couldn't go into but could only look at. Yeah. There were measurable responses to that. People didn't like it. They wanted to be able to go there, but nevertheless, it seemed like there was this almost automatic feeling of restoration. So, you know, there are all kinds of factors that will determine whether or not people will use green spaces, and one of them might be their navigability. If you want to go for a walk and you can't get through without a machete, then you're not going to do it.
But some communities work to make it beautiful because they want the space, and people don't even have the desire to do that.
Yeah, that's a whole other set of really interesting questions about what it takes to make that happen, to make people want to take care of a shared green space themselves rather than to hope that somebody else will do it.
Instead, Russell Hill and Poplar Plains, they're narrow streets, and it's dogs, cyclists, joggers, everybody's. Russell Hill and, you know, Avenue Road and Cycling.
It's past 6. I don't have anywhere to be, but
5-10 minutes?
Yeah. I could keep. I don't think I have very many slides. Oh, I don't need to show you anything else. If we could just talk. question at the back?
I just have a question about some of the cities that have been really hit by economic downturn in the U.S. that have seen a lot of abandoned neighborhoods, like Chicago and parts of the Midwest and the South, like New Orleans. And I'm wondering if you hear any concepts about design where they want to uncover, like in order to redesign, they have this opportunity to have entire spaces that are abandoned. Sorry. If they're looking at doing redesign that has this opportunity to incorporate more green space as people come back into, say redesign New Orleans as a prime example, something that was totally devastated, has the opportunity, a clean slate, for lack of a better way of looking at it, or is it the same old strip mall kind of mentality going into get it in Lego, Lego?
One certainly hopes not. I've heard about a lot of really interesting and creative ideas for how to refashion places that have been hit by the downturn, or any one number of different kinds of downturns. I think that the ideas are certainly there. It's a question of whether the money is there, whether the will can be found to make those kinds of changes. It's really, one of the things that I was asked to talk about, but I haven't really talked about at all, is future cities and what we can do. And the retrofit question is a huge one. My work doesn't really center on those kinds of questions, but I think it touches on them. When we show, for example, that for example, the squatter house in Berlin, when we show that that's something that people love, they don't love it because of its appearance, they love it because of its history, the stories. And so I think, you can imagine all kinds of fantastic ideas that might resurrect or repurpose a part of a city. But one of the things that you're working in the context of is the history and the culture of that place. So that might be one of the reasons why, if it happens, people would gravitate back to things like old strip mall mentality, because that's what this place historically was for. So it takes that kind of creative act to overcome the inertia of the old, when that's something that would have clear benefits for a city like, for example, New Orleans. So yes, I think there are all kinds of great ideas out there, and I think to some extent we're going to have to. We're going to have to change some of the ways that cities are organized. I mean, people have been talking for years about suburban sprawl, and how, in the long term, it seems like, to me, there's not much doubt that that's an unsustainable model for a city. So what's going to happen to these vast areas of development in the outskirts of cities? Are we just going to have to abandon them, or are we going to repurpose them, think about them in an entirely different way? I'm an old country psychologist. I'm not a planner or architect or anything like that. So my expertise and experience in those areas is limited. But I think in some ways the work that I've done does sort of touch on some of these issues.
This is actually going on in Detroit at the moment. A lot of the areas in Detroit are becoming farms. And both farms on the ground and some of the buildings are being changed into vertical farms.
Okay.
So, there's very much a change back to green environment.
Okay.
And these are areas that are basically worthless. Like, you can buy land there for virtually nothing because nobody wants to be there.
Okay. So that's happening in the inner city?
In Detroit, yeah.
Wow.
There's actually a documentary about Detroit, and it's excellent.
Wow.
What they're doing to move to the future.
Because you can buy your neighbor's house you can buy the lot next door for $1 as long as you promise to maintain it. And the city's like, aha, less awful looking lawn to do it.
I have heard that.
Yeah.
Okay. That's very good.
Do you collaborate with your research with Richard Florida, which would be an obvious?
No, I've never done anything with him. I follow his train of thought, but we haven't worked together.
And for the rest of us, who is that?
Richard Florida is an urbanist.
Okay.
He's got a bunch of books. I think the
Creative Cities.
Creative Class, I think, was
Creative
one of the
Class.
Creative Cities.
He's at the Rotman School for
Oh, okay.
Business, creative industry, impact on cities.
So he's a local.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's American, but he
Okay,
got
but he's
straight
a
into
transplant.
it.
Okay.
Yeah, right to the middle there.
And I like with David Miller to create the city that Europe is talking about. They talk about Toronto because of David Miller.
Yeah.
Don't you agree?
Yeah.
I think.
So I'm following up on this. Okay, so you're not working or collaborating with Richard Florida, at least yet. Is there anything or any train of thought you could apply your research to, let's say, how to improve Toronto even more? No, so on paper, it's all right, you know, even the high rise and all this, and we've got the pedestals and we've got the open spaces where you could technically walk into. However, the feel is not quite what it should be or says on the paper. So is there anything?
I'm not sure that I've got anything concrete to offer in terms of a specific solution to any specific problem in Toronto. One of the things that I've been, I don't live here, so I don't live this in the day-to-day, but what I've been hearing from friends of mine who do is that congestion, transportation is becoming increasingly an issue, and when I look at a city like Mumbai, I think, you know, while there's this pressure to densification, which many people say is the future of cities, is Mumbai the future that a city like Toronto has to look forward to?
I suspect Mumbai may have an even poorer public transit system than Toronto. I don't know if that's the case.
It ain't that poor.
Mumbai has a
It ain't that poor.
It has a fantastic transportation system.
Mumbai?
It
Well,
does.
there are more
It's-
subways.
One of my big surprises was that the trains are brilliant.
So does Buenos Aires. So does
But the problem is the density of people.
It just reaches a point.
Massive. Yeah.
Okay.
10 people.
I saw the images and I just see little
Yeah.
cars everywhere. I
No.
imagine they're all single occupancy like it would be in a place like this.
Yeah, no, there's a great train system.
Mhm.
And now I have to say this, which is going to make it sound like it isn't so great, but 10 people a day die on the trains in Mumbai because of the congestion. They're basically, I rode the trains in rush hour, and I would never do it again. It's dangerous. The doors are open. The last people in don't really get in. They're kind of hanging off the side, and sometimes they fall off, and that's how they die. But the routes, the frequency of service is fantastic. It's just, it's the density of people in that city, especially considering that, like many cities throughout the world, a lot of the people, the majority of people who are coming to the city to work are coming in from a long way out in the suburbs.
Okay.
And so they're taking those trains. They all have to get into the city at the same time, and so the rush hour is appalling. But if you can avoid that, the transportation infrastructure is fantastic. And when I first got to Mumbai, I was taking taxis, and somebody said, "Why are you doing that? You know, it'll take you an hour to get 10 blocks. Jump on a train, you'll be there in a minute." And it's true.
So in the design of cities now, for example, is it measured the amount, is it that, like, what is an example of a city that's balanced here, that has the exact amount of, look at like soil or exact amount which is stored in it? And are these taken into consideration when they look at the whole city, like when they're defining one thing, are they looking at the city as a whole? Like, how might that happen?
What is the best city that I know of for, you mean for a balance of green space and
Waterloo.
open space? Sure. There's certainly lots of green space there. I would say certainly in the cities that I visited with the Guggenheim, Berlin was that was one of the things that really surprised me about Berlin, was that from everything that I had heard about the city, I expected it to be a bustling metropolis filled with business and cultural activity, and I expected something like New York. And when I got there and discovered the fantastic infrastructure for urban bicycling, which means that there's much less vehicular traffic in Berlin than there is in a city like New York. Vegetation everywhere, huge old trees on virtually every street. It was for me a hugely restorative experience.
So less crime? Is the crime lower?
I don't know. I don't know. That's a good question.
Did you compare East Berlin to West Berlin?
Not in my experiment, and most of the time that I was in Berlin, I was in East Berlin, and the lab was in East Berlin. But I didn't make that kind of comparison. I heard a lot about it.
There's quite a difference between these two sides of Berlin.
Tell us more about the West Berlin. How is it?
Pardon me?
How is it, West Berlin?
Well, there's some interesting contrast. I mean, East Berlin is getting a lot of money to restore all the old buildings and museums. I found East Berlin was the most interesting from an art perspective. West Berlin seemed to be entirely new. Sony Center was like the major interest in West Berlin.
Yeah.
So, but then East Berlin had a great deal of old, neglected architecture because of the different political systems. Do you have anything to East and West? They're two entirely different places. But the big difference in the history.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I certainly experienced the kind of thing that you're describing in West Berlin, and it would be in the language that I was using earlier. You find more of those impermeable facades in the West, and more of the clinical type in the East. Certainly, in the areas that we were in, it was quite difficult for us to find that impermeable facade in the area around the lab. But in terms of the experiment that we didn't make explicit comparisons with East and West. That would have been interesting.
Who was against the lab coming to Berlin?
I don't know the whether the group, whether there was a single group and whether it was actually named, but the issue was that, and there was some element of this in New York as well. There was some paranoia that this lab was being parachuted into a city as kind of a gentrification machine. That the idea was to land in an area, make a series of recommendations to the city based on maybe trumped up studies that the city could then use as ammunition to gentrify. So we certainly heard those kinds of comments in New York, and some of the people who made those arguments were invited to come to the lab to speak. In Germany, with the first lab site that we planned, we were threatened. We had to move. We were told that things would get ugly if we set up the lab.
Why?
Why? Because they were mistrustful of the objectives of the lab.
I mean, it's funny because because Berlin has a history of kind of also anti-car activism. I wonder if it's kind of associated with BMW. I mean, the irony is what's so great about the kind of open facades. It's a pedestrian facade, and the impermeable facade is a kind of facade you can appreciate or experience in a car because you pass by it quickly. And so it can be experienced aesthetically in a pleasant way in a car, but as you're walking, it's not. And so the kind of paradox that it's BMW sponsoring sponsoring the researchers who would, would say are partly responsible for the kind of impermeable facades in the city. So that it's
yeah, that was certainly, another reason for people being mistrustful of the objectives of the lab is where the money was coming from. Any other questions?
Maybe one last one. Could you describe a bit more about what environmental psychology is leading to? I mean, as a practitioner.
Yeah. Sure. How do I answer this briefly? I think that for me, the most important and exciting thing that's happening in environmental psychology is that it's, as with so many things, I think, it's being driven by the technology. It's becoming much easier for us to be able to carry out all kinds of interesting measurements of people's behavior, the state of their bodies, even their brains. We've got devices that we can put on people's heads to measure their brain waves while they're walking from place to place. So what I see happening in environmental psychology is that we're having opportunities that we didn't have before to move out of the laboratory onto the streets to study things that happen in real places, which has all kinds of problems, and we've talked about some of the problems today, but nevertheless, I think makes the kinds of experiments that we can do much more relevant, because we know when we make findings, we know that we made them where things are actually happening rather than in a sterile lab environment.
One last thing to the comment. BBC Horizons has the latest in the best cities. One of them is in India and one is in Brazil. They're perfect cities, especially in India. I don't know the name, I don't remember. But if you go to BBC Horizons, and on Sundays every weekend they have the program.
That's great. Is this one of those planned design cities?
Yes,
like
yes. With 30 minutes to get to a destination, all the institutions, everything is almost within a walking distance. It's amazing.
Yeah, those are very interesting. China's building a bunch of cities. They're almost like, Lego blocks maybe is not the way to think of it, but it's basically a design for a city of 1 million people that is kind of stamped into the landscape and replicated from place to place. I think that's a really interesting development.
So are the errors.
Sorry?
So are the errors replicated.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's right. Well, thank you very much for.
Thank you.